Oh, hello, guys. How are you? I was watching a very interesting book launch live from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, about how the new extraordinary measures that are being, uh, imposed by the Brazilian government are the potential beginning of a fascist state, a more dictatorial state, more kind of centralized, more arbitrary. Um, and but anyway, I will miss the rest of the presentation. But it is a nice reflection, right? To think on the long term consequences or even immediate political consequences of the crisis over politics over the political life of the countries that are being affected. And Brazil is one of the countries in this part of the Atlantic that has been the most affected. So it's an interesting reflection. Anyway, I hope you have had a good week under the circumstances. Of course, we need to adapt to this new reality, and therefore, yeah, we're trying to make the best of it. Uh, so, as I did last week, I will try to collapse to the two readings assigned for this week into a single lecture. And in this, I will be assisted by Kale's slides that he sent at the beginning of the week that are already posted in e-class. So they are very, very well done, very thorough. And I especially appreciated the images. Thank you, Kale. You did a good job. Um, and uh, the topic or the lesson of Latin America that we're going to discuss today is social policy. Social policy, of course, is a very broad area of impact. So it goes all the way from pensions, healthcare, education, unemployment, family allotments, family policies, affordable housing, that kind of thing. But in order to make our reflection more pointed, more specific, we're going to focus only on the first two items that I mentioned here: pension reform and healthcare. Although I'm going to add some comments about the education at the end of the lecture. Education is not covered by the readings, I agree, but it is still interesting to reflect on some of the Latin American experiences along social policy. So the main thing, or the main thesis, or the thing that has to be in our minds when we're talking about this issue is the following: that social policy reforms in Latin America are very much about finding the right balance between the state and the market, between public contributions, public participation, public responsibility for providing services, sometimes essential services, sometimes uh, assistance to people in need, um, that are delivered either by the public or by private companies. There is a great deal of studies that some of them believe that the only way to guarantee that services are going to be universal, affordable, accessible to everyone, it is relying on the public sector. But on the other hand, there are other studies, other points of view that believe that the market is better at organizing delivery of these services as if they were uh, services provided by private corporations, as if they are like a merchandise. Uh, so the experiments that we're going to discuss are the search in several countries of Latin America for the right balance, for the right equilibrium between the market and the state in delivering uh, social policy. Of course, some countries have been more successful than others in specific areas of public policy, in specific areas of social policy. So we're going to discuss a little bit more in detail how these things have panned out over time. Okay, so starting with pension reform. Um, in the early 1980s, uh, a specific Latin American country, Chile, started departing from the prevailing model for giving pensions to people who retire, people who are already too old to keep working, by inventing a new system, right? A new system that would create a kind of a new threshold, a new model that would be replicated in other parts of the world. So the traditional system is what um, is called pay as you go system, or PAGO or PAYG, depending on the literature that we read. But bottom line, pay as you go refers to what I would call the intergenerational system. That is to say that you work when you are young, when you are in a productive age, when you develop your career, you pay your taxes, you contribute to a pension fund, and when you're ready to retire, you start tapping from that pension fund, and that pension fund is in turn nourished, is grown with the contributions that younger workers, people that are younger than you, make to that pension fund. This has been um, the traditional or the standard way in which until the early 1980s, countries, different welfare states handled pensions. People with their taxes, with their contribution, companies as well, private companies, employers, that is, contributed to a big pool of money that will be tapped from at the time of retirement of these workers. The problem is that, as you may imagine, this is kind of betting, the system is betting on the expectation that the number of people retiring is more or less the same number of people who are still active or are still working, and that the money that has been accumulated over a person's lifetime will be enough to as a contribution to pay for that same person in the old age. This is not always the case. Some countries where, for instance, the population is older, the I mean as a proportion of the whole population, uh, then that means that the tax base or people who are contributing are smaller than the number of people who are going to receive that benefit, and it makes therefore the system difficult to manage, and if not unsustainable. Because pensions, you never know how much you're going to have to pay for those pensions. It depends on a person's lifespan. But with advancement in medicine, advancement in science, people live longer. They are expecting to be paid for longer periods of time, and therefore it becomes like very difficult for governments to be able to foresee that the amount that is going to be needed for covering this social program, and sometimes even to fund it. So, given this situation, the government of Chile in the early 1980s came with a solution that seemed quite original, quite innovative at the time, which was privatized retirement. Instead of privatization means that instead of relying on state managed pensions, on this system, pay as you go systems, and the taxes that we pay to government, from then on, uh, each worker, each person during their active life will create their personal retirement account, um, that will be managed by a private institution, that is called the pension fund managers, or the AFP institutions, for when you uh, say the same thing in Spanish. And if you contribute every time from your paycheck 10 or 20% of what you make to this fund, At the end of of your active life, you will have enough. You will have accumulated enough resources to retire decently. That was at least the expectation. And the funds are not just standing there under the mattress, or just uh, laying idle in a savings account, but the funds could be invested in the market, and the stock market, that is, in order to increase the gains. And at the end of the day, at least the theory went, you could be very successful, accumulate lots of money over your productive life, and at the same time, this money available will help capitalize the economy. So this model presented itself as a win-win situation for both the workers and the economy, right? Good for the worker because you are investing in yourself, you are uh, saving for your own retirement. The more you contribute, of course, at the end of the day, at the end of your active life, you are going to have more resources available. And at the same time, this money, this capital is being used in productive ways by being invested in the stock market. So the model captured the imagination of many governments, and in Latin America and beyond. And even in the United States, it started creating an impact, which is kind of one of the exceptions, I would think, one of the surprising um, instances where a model that was created in the global south, in this case in Chile and Latin America, has an impact over models that or reforms that are attempted elsewhere in the world, in this case, the United States. However, you know, the theory, this private savings for your own retirement, in practice, it wasn't that uh, rosy. That it didn't function exactly as it was expected, and therefore there was a bit of a controversy between the supporters and the detractors of this model. Let's see what are the main reasons why the tractors don't like the model, why they have decided to uh, to object the model, that there is resistance for the model to be adopted. First of all, we need to put things into context. The early 1980s, in specifically in 1981, when the reform was implemented first in Chile, it was a military regime. The military regime that lasted from 1973 to 1990, as you may remember, until it was defeated in the referendum. We talked about that in class. And the author of the reform was the Minister of Labor and Social Security of the Pinochet government, of the military dictatorship. The name of this minister is Jose Piñera. He was an economist, trained at Harvard University, and was strongly influenced by neoliberal ideas. So this idea of giving pensions to the market, making the workers directly responsible for their own retirement, their own private savings, and not expecting much from the state, is perfectly in keeping with the philosophy, the neoliberal philosophy of individual responsibility, of taking care of oneself, of relying on the market rather than the public, and generally speaking, offloading the state of this type of responsibilities, especially the long-term responsibility that implies paying for the retirement of many people. Jose Piñera was the perfect example of a right-wing intellectual that has also existed in many other countries of Latin America that have uh, helped implement neoliberal reforms and have shaped the the political landscape, the institutions in many countries of Latin America, especially during the 1980s and 1990s, which is kind of the neoliberal period in the area. Jose Piñera is also remarkable because he is the brother of the current president of Chile, Sebastián Piñera, and he is someone who is very close and is very appreciated by some of the most notable neoliberal think tanks in the world, such as the Cato Institute, the International Center for Pension Reform. So we're talking here about an economist with a political agenda, and a political agenda that is loaded to the right, and this is what explains that he was chosen by the Pinochet government for directing the social policy. So the reform I was saying was praised, was supported, was encouraged by some um, thinkers, some economists, both in Chile and elsewhere, even in the United States. The Republican Party and some politicians try to adapt the same type of reforms to their own country in order to make this uh, social policy, pensions, private, make them depend on the workers themselves. However, as our textbook writes, citing some of the critics, this is a system that is good for Chile but bad to most Chileans. What do they mean by that? Well, what they mean is that if even if the system was good for the state, because the state was kind of washing um, its hands, very popular these days, washing one's hands, um, and offloading that responsibility to the workers, and even if the market, the capital market was getting all the influx of this fresh money from the workers. The fact of the matter is that many workers, individual workers, were not getting what it was expected from the system. So, what were the main issues? Were the main obstacles for making this work? The first one was the type of people or the type of institutions that will manage these pension funds. Any financial company was allowed to become an AFP, one of those pension fund managers. It was, of course, an unprecedented and very praised, very valuable opportunity available to even experienced corporations to become uh, recipients of this money, to manage that money. So it was an easy way to make a profit, even if they weren't sure how to better manage this money, specifically for the benefit of the workers, of the contributors to the pension fund. The other issue that was discovered over time is that for some workers, even their lifetime savings were not enough to get a decent pension. So even if they were contributing 10%, 20% of their salaries every month, at the end of the day, when they retired, the the money that was accumulated was not enough to get a decent living pension. Some Chilean workers, after a long life of work, could get a pension of about 100 US dollars, which is very low for Canada, but also still a low in Chile. Um, so it was discovered with the experience, with the bad experience of some workers, that this system of privatized pensions works better for higher earners, but not for everyone. Um, uh, so And this is a bit ironic because in Chile, even though the privatization of pensions was mandatory for everyone, the army rejected for themselves. In other words, the soldiers, the officers, etc., were exempted from this privatization of their retirement, of this obligation to accumulate individually for paying their own pension. So they were still relying on the pay as you go system, or the old traditional system. Another problem with that privatization of a retirement is that it had a limited coverage. In 2005, only half of Chilean workers were covered. The other ones were not saving at all for their retirement, and therefore it was creating a big problem for the future. What are you going to do with people who are not entitled to public pension, but on the other hand, they don't have money for private retirement? How are they going to live? That is the question is that simple. Another issue that the critics realized was making the system not work as expected, is that the profits that were generated by the investment of the pension funds were not accumulated for the worker, but they were uh, kind of taken by the pension managers as uh, um, their fees, their administration fees for moving the money, for investing the money. So the first waves of retirees under this system got much less money than they were expected because of all these fees that were excessive, that would eat up between one quarter and one third of all the savings. So let's say that over your productive life, you've saved $1 million, but little by little contributing 10% of your monthly income to that individual pension fund. And you're expecting that you're going to get $1 million, but at the end of the day, you only get 750,000 or 660,000, which is, not uh, necessarily the best when invested. Doesn't yield the same return as you were expecting. Um, so the system in Chile was so disappointing. The pension system was so disappointing that uh, as soon as the military government receded and the new governments, the democratically elected governments were elected, the need for reforming the system was felt. In other words, the idea of offloading the responsibility for pensions from the back of the state and giving it to individuals was not a bad idea per se, but the problem is that you cannot do that in an absolute way. And a more balanced approach that would preserve some of the benefits of the pay-as-you-go system with the privatized combined with the privatized system needed to be found, and this is precisely what subsequent governments in Chile did. So the reform system was based on three pillars. The first one was that the government will guarantee pensions to avoid that people fall into poverty. This is what is called, it was called at the time, the system of solidarity pensions that would benefit 1.1 million people. In other words, even if your savings were not enough, even if your salary didn't provide uh, much in terms of contributions for those privatized pension funds, even if the AFP, the manager of your pension fund, had eaten up most of your savings, the government would guarantee that your income when you were a pensioner wouldn't fall below a certain minimum that was kind of compensated, subsidized by the government itself. Um, Also, the individual accounts, the private accounts for saving for retirement, was subsidized, was supplemented with some money support coming from the government. And that subsidy will be applicable especially for younger workers that made a very low salary. And here, this is an interesting thing for women that, as in Chile, as in many other parts of the world, including Canada, make less income on average than men. Um, and also, there was control put on the AFP, on the managers of pension funds, um, on the fees that would be taken from the accounts, and also the number of institutions that would provide this service would be encouraged, would be enlarged in order to create more competition. That those private managers of pension funds would be forced to offer better conditions to the workers in order to get their savings, and therefore, the deal that the workers would get would be fair. Now, this um, reform to the system is interesting, was implemented in 2006 by the very brother of Jose Piñera, Sebastián Piñera, who had to acknowledge that the fully privatized system was not working as expected, and had to be a change, had to be tweaked in a way to compensate for the failings of the market, for the failings of this absolutely private system. And if you think about it, the system of blended individual responsibility and public responsibility is what we have here in Canada, right? There is a Canada Pensions Fund, um, supplemented with old age pensions. All that money is coming from the taxes that we pay, contributions that we make when we are workers, when we are active. Uh, but this system is usually not enough, doesn't provide for a very high income when you retire. So people are encouraged to save for their own retirement in the so-called RSPs. So this mixed system of RSPs that are, by the way, controlled. So the financial institutions that manage them need to have a certain certification, a certain fulfill certain requirements, and of course the fees that they can charge for their management are controlled. Um, so the Chilean model was adopted in many countries in Latin America. Uh, this combination of public and private, but there are mixed stories of success and failure of the model, depending on several issues. The first one is the coverage. It is calculated that up to 70% of the workers in Latin America, on average, not making regular contributions to those pension funds. So, uh, expecting that the private savings will be enough for a decent retirement is not valid, is not true for every country in Latin America. The problem is compounded, or is made worse by the fact that the informal sector is, or the self-employed workers in Latin America is very big. This informal sector, that is also called the black market, is those workers that are not registered as such, that don't pay taxes, that make whatever kind of activity they can find for a living. Uh, and because they are not paying taxes, they are not registered anywhere. They are not saving for their retirement. They don't have their private accounts, and therefore, when they retire, when they are unable to work, they are either supported by the state or they fall into destitution. So the coverage issue is the first problem that is still to be solved by pension reforms in Latin America. The second problem is the high administration fees. As I said, the first generation of retirees in Chile were uh, uh, found themselves in a very difficult situation because their privately accumulated funds were not enough for a decent living after retirement. Um, uh, the competition among AFPs, those institutions that manage the pension funds, was not as intense as expected, um, and therefore the choices that are open to the workers are not all that attractive. And this situation is made worse by the widespread financial illiteracy. So people don't really understand uh, how to invest, where to invest, uh, before it is too late, and they have loss of their savings. All those savings have been eroded by the high administration fees. And the third issue that has been in the way, has got in the way of a decent pension reform in Latin America, is the gender inequality. Generally speaking, women have lesser salaries, and also the contributions that the employers make to these private pension funds are lower for female workers, and therefore this issue of gender inequality is still present. So even if Chile invented the model, over time corrected it to make it more balanced, more uh, fair, where with participation of the state, of public money, of tax dollars into the mix. Um, Not every country in Latin America has been has been successful in finding the right balance along the way. So this is what Carmelo Mesa Lago, the article that was assigned for this unit as well, uh, and that Kale presented, prepare. I'm sorry, PowerPoint slides for. Makes a more detailed investigation into um, the pension reforms that were made in other countries of Latin America beyond Chile. The article that you read about, written by Carmelo Mesa Lago, is a review essay that is encompassing uh, a number of authors, 60 plus authors, uh, about 13 countries, um, about reforms in the areas of pension and healthcare. So it's a very comprehensive review essay. So Mesa Lago adds other precisions about this system that was invented in Chile. The first thing that he notes is that the World Bank in 1994 started directly and enthusiastically, I should say, promoting the model as the solution for balancing the books in the countries that had kind of limited amounts of money, or even in richer countries that wanted to lower their public expenditures. Um, in that, in the 1994 report, then the World Bank uh, was praising this model of privatization as a bold solution to growing problems. But years later, Even the Global Bank, the World Bank, acknowledged that they went too far. They oversold the model, and they were unable to see some of the problems that it may carry with it. So Mesalago distinguishes three general models that are very well explained in one of Kale's slides. Uh, Three general models for pension reform. The first one is the substitutive, where the public system is closed. There is no public retirement at all. Everything is privatized. It is a system that, as we saw, was adopted in Chile before the reforms during the military dictatorship, but also in countries such as Bolivia, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Mexico, and Nicaragua. The second model is the parallel model, where um, the new private system competes with the public one. So the public system is not totally eliminated, but there is a new private alternative that competes with the public one. So the workers have the choice of staying in the old system or participating in the in the private system. This model, the parallel model, was put in practice in Colombia and Peru. And then there is a third model that is called the mixed model, uh, where the private system becomes supplementary to a basic public system. So there is a public system that provides for the basic needs, but the workers have the option of adding to that private savings to make their retirement more comfortable. This is the system that was created in Argentina, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Uruguay, and as we saw in Chile as well after the reforms. And this is the system that exists here in Canada, right? Um, Basic retirement guaranteed by the state, by the public purse, but with the possibility of making it more comfortable if you save throughout your life. So, what are the challenges that uh, this system encounters, or that pension reform encounters? I identify six challenges that are also explained in Kale's slides. The first one is that the coverage of the pension system has reached only half of labor force in two countries with full privatization, Chile and Mexico. So what is going to happen to the rest of the workers? That's anybody's guess. In all other countries, the coverage is even lower, right? In the countries where there is kind of a parallel or a mixed system, it's below 50% that the works that are covered. Um, this, of course, raises doubts on whether the system is useful at all for providing to the whole population, and is a system that is oblivious of the informal labor market. The second challenge is precisely related to the labor market, that the formal sector is shrinking, increasing formal work. Um, that means that the coverage in the formal sector is four times higher than in the formal sector. And also the new trends of globalization that are called labor flexibilization, when you are hired by short contracts with no benefits, part time, uh, that you can be basically fired at any point in time, were promoted also by neoliberalism. The third challenge is that pensions for the poor are provided in six Latin American countries, but they are insufficient to cover basic needs, or they are conditional on bureaucratic requirements. Uh, so the poor can access these funds, they can access some kind of support, but uh, they are insufficient to cover their basic needs. The fourth challenge is something that we already mentioned, that there is insufficient competition among the providers of this system, of this management. So uh, the institutions that manage these funds count with captive clienteles, the workers that have a little choice, and this create oligopolies of uh, market that don't encourage corporations to be more responsive, to be more um, attuned to the needs of the workers. This happens especially for the smaller markets, such as El Salvador, where uh, workers have only two choices of institutions. Bolivia, also two choices. Chile, six choices. Mexico is 12, so it's a little better. But this is not necessarily conducing to meaningful competition among these institutions. The fifth challenge is the cost associated with private natures of funds. Uh, Private management of funds is always more expensive than public management for the simple reason that private corporations need to make a profit. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to be into that business. So uh, these privatized retirements in general are costly for the workers in terms of fees, in terms of uh, other charges that are made by the managers of these pensions. Also, because uh, these companies are only managing part of the workforce in a given country, there is a loss of the economies of scale, the ability of buying in bulk, of having purchasing power that comes naturally with the publicly managed system of the time of the past. Um, and finally, the final challenge, the sixth challenge here, is that the capitalization that private pension plans are able to produce is not very important, is not very useful for countries with small capital markets, especially the countries in Central America. Well, as usual, you can interrupt anytime you want. You can ask questions in the chat room on the side, uh, or or have comments. I'd be happy to sort of address those comments, those questions, um, to redirect our conversation here. Okay, so the other area of reform that is discussed in Mesa Lagos' article is healthcare. Uh, Mesa Lago tells us that in the 1990s, all countries in Latin America, no exceptions, experienced issues with their healthcare systems. Um, on the need to expand coverage, to improve quality, um, to also how to fund those healthcare systems. So in a matter of 15 years, from early 1990 to 2005, all 20 of them, all 20 Latin American countries had operated some kind of reform to their healthcare system. So this is an area of investigation very interesting for comparative politics, comparative comparative policy studies, and again, seeing to what extent some countries found a better mix of private public, and others, got caught in the contradictions of this contrasting approaches to the delivery of healthcare. Uh, Countries in Latin America, all 20 countries in Latin America, resorted to privatization, as was the case for the pension systems, only to a much more limited extent. Only between 13 and 25% of the population was covered in the countries where privatization has advanced the most. So yes, it has grown, it has expanded, but it is not as prevalent, as uh, generalized as it was for pension plans as discussed. So there's a wide variation in the healthcare models that were adopted in the region over this 15-year period of time. And Carmelo Mesa Lago identifies 10 separate models, but discusses only 6 cases. First, there are some cases where reforms were deep, were comprehensive, were more radical, and allegedly were more successful in their efforts for providing good quality healthcare to the uh, largest amounts of people possible. The first of such cases is Colombia. And I'm happy Colombia, we can finally say something about good about Colombia because so far we hadn't uh, presented Colombia as an example of anything really. So the Colombian healthcare system was reformed in 1993 with a two-pronged system. The first one was the so-called contributing sector, and that is based on markets based on private suppliers of services, and the subsidized, those are the terms that are used, contributing and subsidized uh, sector for people with less resources. The coverage of the whole healthcare system in Colombia increased from 21% in 1993 to 57% of 1997. I mean, 57% is not ideal because you still have almost half of the population not covered yet, but it is certainly better than the 21%. The bulk of this expansion was made in the subsidized sector, that is to say, the sector paid by the public from the public purse that was directed to people with less resources. But because it was paid with public money, it eventually stalled because of a scarcity of those resources. The other successful model that Carmelo Mesa Lago discusses is Brazil, one of those comprehensive reforms that eventually improved the health care conditions of the average person in that country. So Brazil created something that is called the Integrated Public Service, or SUS, that was divided in federal, state, and municipal funded services. The private sector comes on top of that, covering about 20% of the population. Um, in the end, putting the reforms to the public and the private systems made that by 2003, the primary healthcare was virtually universal in that country. So even more successful than in Colombia, in that sense that coverage reached 100% of the population of close to that. That was primary care and that was basic services, but for more sophisticated things and for people expecting a better quality service, the differences persisted among classes and especially among regions. The region of the northeast is one of the poorest regions in Brazil. Uh, was clearly below the standards of service of the southwestern Brazil, which is the most populous areas of the country. So this inequality was not eliminated with the reforms. Uh, the reforms were perfected by the governments of the Workers' Party, and for some time the uh, health attention was supplemented with one unexpected factor, one unexpected contributor, which was doctors coming from Cuba. The Workers' Party, being a leftist party, had a very good relationships with the Cuban government, and they agreed on a system of swapping uh, the services of Cuban medical doctors for especially for rural and poor areas for uh, in exchange for other essential goods for uh, to be provided to the island, especially energy, especially oil, which is a constant nightmare for that country. So the system was working very well. People who or some settlements, some populations in the Amazon or in other faraway regions in Brazil that had never had medical service had it for the first time thanks to the Cuban doctors. But as in many other areas that we have discussed in this course, the election of the current right wing president, Jair Bolsonaro, was bad news for that uh, program because he decided to basically kick out those Cuban doctors, accusing them of being spies, of being agents of revolution, and bottom line, useless people. Now I know because I've had some uh, comments and from the press, from friends in Brazil, that the government regrets very much so having kicked out all these medical doctors because they would come in very handy to fight the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic right now. Because if you check the statistics, Brazil is one of the highest hit uh, countries in terms of the pandemic. By the way, I don't know if you follow the news. Cuba sent uh, an army really of medical doctors to Italy to help them out to try to contain the expansion of the pandemic. Italy being, as you probably know, following the news, one of the hardest hit countries in the world. Okay, moving on. Were the more successful, Colombia and Brazil. There were other countries that also operated reforms, but in the end were not all that successful. The first one is Argentina, that created a mixed federal provincial system of healthcare delivery, supplemented by an institution that they call obras sociales, social works, uh, that is managed by unions. Unions in Argentina are very strong behind the Peronista party, um, and they supplemented the efforts of the federal and provincial systems. The problem is that the there is no coordination between what the provinces and the federal government provide or the obras sociales provide. So it is basically left to each person's or each worker's chance or ability to find a good spot in the healthcare system, the quality of the service that they're going to receive, if they're going to receive any service at all. There is a private sector as well, but it is unregulated. So in Argentina, you can go to uh, a private doctor anytime you want, and if you have the means to do that. But there is no quality control. There is no price control, and therefore the private sector is a risky business for the average person in that country. Another country that proceeded to moderate reforms, piecemeal reforms, was Costa Rica. As we had discussed previously, um, the country created a social security institute called the CCSS that achieved almost a universal coverage. Uh, but in the 1990s, uh, the system, in order to alleviate their burden, their financial burden, started subcontracting private services and decentralizing. This privatization meant that some of the services started costing people in the country money, and therefore their high quality and comprehensive care that were they had achieved before the reforms uh, took a hit. It was not as comprehensive as before. The other country that proceeded to piecemeal model reforms was Panama. Um, there, they established a system of public social insurance called CSS, um, that is integrated across the Panamanian territory and uh, has achieved nearly universal coverage. In 1998, the government of Panama created an agency called the Consalud for the delivery of healthcare through an integrated hospital called the HISMA. Problem is that the HISMA subcontracts with private providers that are costlier, that not everyone can afford, and it is a very centralized system that where you need to be referred by a family doctor before you can see any specialist, and this has deteriorated the average attention that citizens in that country can get. The final case that is discussed by Carmelo Mesa Lago is Bolivia, where the government created a system that is called SUMI, Seguro Universal Materno Infantil, meaning universal insurance for mothers and children, that provides basic services for everyone, almost universal coverage, but focus on the name of the institute, mothers and children, for the early childhood, for pregnant women, which is fine, which is good. But what about other type of healthcare needs? That one is much less covered. Mm, the As a result, about 79% of the population in Bolivia is still not covered with a good healthcare, and the the public assistance or the public delivery of healthcare is still controlled, very centralized in the hands of the government in a or coordinated system according depending on the region. So it is interesting to note how some countries that are otherwise very successful in some respects, such as Costa Rica, such as Bolivia, we use them as examples of demilitarization uh, and multinationalism and recognition of indigenous rights. On the other hand, they are not so good. They are not so efficient when it comes to healthcare delivery. So there is no perfect country in the area, really. Any comments? Any questions? Feel free to drop them. Okay, I'll simply conclude with some observations, some comments regarding education. Education, another important area of social policy where uh, major reforms were attempted, were put in practice in Latin America, and where the end results were very uh, different from one country to the next one. So let me just add some comments of some countries that operated uh, reforms and how these reforms panned out. The first country I want to talk about is Brazil. In the 1988 constitution, right after the military dictatorship, uh, it was established that uh, the country will create a system of free tuition in public institutions, higher education institutions, that is. But the funny thing is that even though it was part of the constitutional text, it was not uh, implemented, fully implemented. There was federal expenditure, of course, subsidy to public institutions, but it was far from being guaranteed free tuition to all the people who were admitted into these public institutions. Instead, there was a trend towards privatization of higher education, um, which meant that the offer of institutions, the offer of higher education increased in the country over time, and the enrollment increased consequently. But, and this is kind of a sad uh, legacy of privatization, the number of dropouts also increased. People who were able to make it to university because there were more places available, but in the end were unable to complete their studies because of the financial burden that this represents. Also, there was an increase in student debt and debt defaults of students that had completed a degree, or even if they hadn't completed, uh, a situation that is eerily familiar to what happens in in Canada, or more importantly in the United States. Now let's talk about Ecuador, the other case that I wanted to mention here. Um, in the 2008 constitution in that country, it was established again that the free higher education is a basic right for every Ecuadorian, um, and that was followed by um, a law passed in 2010 called the Higher Education Law, um, that um, in on paper made it possible, or enshrined the right of every person in Ecuador who wanted to do higher education to attend a public university. But the funny thing is that universities are dependent on their own sources of income. There is no subsidy given to universities, uh, which forces them to, even if they are public, even if they are mandated to provide education to everyone, it forces them to um, charge fees, sometimes quite steep, to the students attending the institutions. The other case I wanted to mention after Ecuador is Chile. In Chile, the country, the legislator passed in 1990 or what is called the Organic Constitutional Educational Law, that basically promoted the privatization and of universities and reduced the funding to the public institutions. That law uh, establishes that education is a commodity, that it is the responsibility of parents to provide for education to their children. It is not the state's obligation to do that. And this privatization also made it simpler, less kind of bureaucratically burdensome to create a new higher education institutions, with the result that nowadays in Chile there are hundreds of private institutions, some larger, some more prestigious, some better quality, and others not so big, not so good in education, but all of them private and some of them quite expensive. Um, so the enrollment of people in universities increased because there was this offer, so many institutions available, but the tuition also increased. Um, it is calculated that 30% of the per capita income of every Chilean goes into tuition, right? So this means that the average cost of tuition in Chile is higher even than the United States. Um, so ever since, and this hasn't changed really, um, Chile is the country in Latin America where higher education is the most expensive, the most exclusive, and For that reason, the protests that we've seen occurring over the past few years, starting with students, have targeted this unfairness of having to pay such a high tuition, and you know not enjoying or not even having the right of some public support for um, for their effort. And the Chileans, or the Chilean protesting the privatized system, are even more upset when they compare across the border in Argentina, where uh, free tuition in public universities was established with the uh, return to democracy. There is a network of what is called national universities that are uh, completely funded by the federal government, where students are accepted and are tuition free, totally tuition free, along the lines of what exists in countries like France, like Germany. Um, that has become a major um, asset for increasing the average level of education in that country. Finally, I wanted to mention that Mexico is another country that went along the lines of the Chilean model, not to that extreme, but certainly along the same path. That is to say, a very robust public system that existed until the 1980s was gradually replaced by a more competitive private system, more aggressive in recruiting students, that sometimes in some institutions for sure offers better quality, but that overall is very selective and expensive for the average student. So there you go. This is what I wanted to comment in three areas of social policy, and to draw your attention to this common trend, this common theme that you see developing in all countries of Latin America. That in order to provide for better services that are at the same time more affordable for the government, the private sector has been called to intervene, to contribute somehow with their expertise, with their direct delivery of services. But the contribution of the private sector only creates new problems. In fact, the public sector is still, the backbone of social policy in Latin America, and experience has shown that the more kind of activist the states are, the public system is in kind of overseeing how pensions are managed, how education is managed, how healthcare is delivered, accessibility of these services is going to reach uh, the citizens properly. So this is it. I wonder if you have any questions or any comments. I again strongly encourage you to check Kale's slides. They are very comprehensive, and that will certainly expand on some of the things that I just said. But for the moment, I think that the, the basics of the two readings and the conducting flows of ideas between the two are already put on the table. Okay, I guess you don't have any questions right now, but you can always email me. I will try to reply as soon as possible, and we will meet again Thursday, next Thursday. That is the April 2nd, I believe. Anyway, Thursday next week at 2 p.m. So we can and deal with the second last unit in our course. And if you have any questions about the final, you can also think about them and ask the questions at that time. So, yeah, that's it for me. Um, Try to cope with the emergency, stay at home if you don't have to go out, and stay safe. Okay? All right. Take care.